Let me wish you a very warm welcome, everybody, to the Social Contract Research Seminar today. This is part of the Social Contract Research Network, which is a forum for addressing theoretical and practical questions related to the nature and the limits and the future of this thing that we call the social contract in our society. This is the final seminar this semester, and there's going to be a new program announced soon for next semester. If you would like to join our mailing list, then do please feel free to follow the link that I'm just going to post in the chat here, where you'll find details about future events and how to keep in touch with us. It is my particular honor today to introduce our speaker, Peter Hallward. I've only begun corresponding with Peter relatively recently, but I do feel that I know him much longer than that, because his books have been a regular companion in my intellectual life. I can't think of the work of any philosopher on any philosopher that has helped me more than Peter's Bad You are Subject to Truth. In addition to being precise and rigorous and engaged, it's also a book that helped me learn how to write about philosophy well. When I was struggling with an introduction to one of my books and looking for a model to use and adapt, Peter's book was the first that I pulled off my shelf. Peter now works as a professor of modern European philosophy at Kingston University in the UK, and his research is primarily in modern political philosophy. In addition to the Badiou volume, he's published monographs on Deleuze and the post-colonial and contemporary Haiti. He regularly writes for The Guardian and Radical Philosophy, among other outlets, and he's currently working on a book entitled The Will of the People, alongside brief studies of Rousseau, Marx, and Blanqui. And in all this, he marries an acuity of mind with, I think it's fair to say, a generosity of spirit and an instinct for fairness towards those with whom he disagrees. Peter will speak for roughly 50 minutes today, after which there'll be time for discussion. If you'd like to make a comment or ask a question at the end of the talk, do please write a brief summary of it in the chat, and then I'll call on you to turn on your video and ask your question at the appropriate moment. Peter's title for today is The Most Absolute Authority, Rousseau's Divided Legacy. So please do join me in welcoming Professor Peter Hallward.
Thank you so much, Chris. And good afternoon or evening to most of you, good morning to some of you. Thank you very much for coming along to this. So I'm hoping that I've judged this right, which is possible that I haven't. That what I thought I would do is something that's very distilled and kind of simplified, really, about Rousseau. I've been trying to write a kind of textbook chapter on him, one of those sort of, introduction to everything kind of books, and which has been fun to do in a way because it just obliges you to really distill down what is the core of what Rousseau is trying to get at. What is his main idea? Why should we bother to read him, really? So I've been thinking about that, and I thought what I would try to do is distill it down to about 5 core quotations. So that's what I've tried to do. Work out the absolute minimal skeleton. If you want to grapple with Rousseau, what are the things that you should grapple with? So I'm going to give you 5 quotes spaced out over the next 45 minutes or so. I'm not going to give you a PowerPoint or share a screen or anything. So if you want to make a note of them, you're going to need a pen or to write them down in some other way. So 5 little quotes. Which will be then, of course, radically simplified. And maybe at this stage of your work on the social contract, it's going to be too obvious and not that interesting, in which case we can kind of skip over to the other side of it, which is the opposite in a way, which is very broad brush, super speculative musings about political organization in general, emancipatory political organization. What does Rousseau have to tell us about that? And there, although I've been working on a couple of specific sequences, I'd love to just open the door completely and just think, how helpful is this approach for thinking about organizing in a trade union or a political party or a national liberation movement or a revolutionary sequence? Or because of the limits of time, the sequence that I might evoke a few times are some episodes in the American Civil Rights Movement, particularly in the early 60s. a group that some of you will know well, and at one point was very much at the forefront of that agenda, but perhaps a little bit less these days, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, SNCC, which did some really amazing things in Mississippi in the early 60s and some other places too, and whose trajectory is very suggestive. So although it's very easy to get lost in the details of any historical sequence, I would like to try to come back to that a little bit as one of many examples of trying to use tools that Rousseau helped put on the agenda, but there's no issue here of direct influence. I don't think the SNCC people read Rousseau. I've never run into him as a point of reference there. But helpful, I think, for understanding some of the problems that they were confronting. And in principle, that's what I'd like to see, is how far can Rousseau's broad approach be helpful for understanding all kinds of emancipatory political sequences? Or what are the limits? At what point does his undeniable misogyny or Eurocentrism or hypocrisy or all the lists of failings that you can attribute to Rousseau, and it's a long list, and I'm not going to go into it here, but easy to expand that list probably. At what point does that narrow down what the significance of his thought, of his core thought? And where is this difference really between philosophy, say, and political practice, thinking things through in practice, as opposed to in a utopian normative book like Social Contract. So those are some of the things that I'm sort of percolating in the background, but and if you're willing, then what I'll do is just kind of go through these 5 quotations, okay? And again, with slight apprehension that maybe they're too simple, but we'll see. And I'll just go through them. So there is a sequence here, and there's a point of departure then. And the point of departure, like any point of departure, is a bit abrupt and is affirmed as a point of departure, which is to say it doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not, there's no pretense here to say that it's just somehow some abstract place. But it is a point of departure, a place from which you set out. And I think Rousseau does offer that. And the place he sets out from is with this idea of the will. The core of his whole theory then of a general will is grounded in his account of the will itself. And so my first quote is from Emile. A lot of these quotes are going to be coming from Emile. It's short, and it runs, "The principle of every action is in the will of a free being." I'm going to do that too. Again, the principle of every action is in the will of a free being. And this itself is a compression of 2 principles that he's affirmed as sort of dogmas or articles of faith. In the Emile, this is all coming from the Confession of the Savoyard Vicar. It compresses 2 sort of preliminary points. One is that there's no true action without will. That's the first one. He calls that my first principle, my first dogma, my first article of faith. So that this is a kind of radical affirmation, if you like. There's no true action without will. And the second one, there's no true will without freedom. So these are from book 4. If you want to track it down, you'll find it in Bloom's translation. And if you're reading it in French, there's an online edition that numbers the paragraph. And that's paragraph 982. So just to ponder this for a minute. The principle of every action is in the will of a free being. A couple of things to note about it. One is that it's posited as an article of faith. And a bit like Kant, Rousseau doesn't try to give a theoretical justification for it. He doesn't offer a kind of deduction that would justify in theory the primacy of this principle. He justifies it more, and I think Kant gets a lot of his affirmation of the primacy of practice, practical reason from this, by its practical sufficiency. So for an actor, for someone interested in action, the principle is the will of the actor, the will of a free being. And that is posited here quite explicitly as saying, I can't give you a better justification for it in theory, but I don't need to in practice because it's sufficient in practice. As actors concerned with action, all we need to know is this. And he posits it, goes on to describe it as I just take this as given, essentially. And I will posit its sufficiency as a point of practice. So the rest of it will be to unpack then what's at stake in this practice. It's an affirmation, I'll just note parenthetically, that does resonate, I think, with a broad recognition that political authority does have to acknowledge this conception of practice or action in some way if it wants to be legitimate. And that does mark a kind of change in broadly early modern political philosophy. You can no longer say something like the principle of all behavior, all human social action or something is grounded in involuntary or subvoluntary forms of behavior or action. Arguably, you could say that that was the case for large periods of history, that you didn't need to refer certainly to the will of the people who were obeying sovereign commands, for example, or the will of people who were broadly at the bottom of the social pyramid. But with the kind of collapse of feudalism and the rise of what will become capitalism and all the various things associated with that, that idea that you could ground sort of an account of legitimate political authority without referring in some sense or other to the will of the people who were compelled to obey it no longer has any traction, or not much traction. So I think from Hobbes on, at least, there's an explicit recognition that you have to take seriously, one way or another, the will of the people being commanded by power. For a legitimate command to hold and solicit real obedience, you're going to have to solicit something like the will of the people being called to obey it. And the arguments are then, what does that involve, and so on. So that's a kind of first point, my first quote. The second quote then, again short, and I'll give it to you both in English and in French. And this is again from Émile, and what Rousseau says is the truly free person, the truly free man. So Rousseau always, like a lot of the French period, writers of the time, but perhaps more than many, masculinizes his pronouns and his points of reference. But the truly free person, the truly free man, wills or wants, this word veut, I'll have to come back to it, wills or wants only what he can do, and he does what he pleases. And this again is affirmed as a formula, as an affirmation, a kind of a radical principle. He calls it my fundamental maxim. And I'm going to give it to you in French because Rousseau is pleased with the rhyming quality of it. L'homme vraiment libre ne veut que ce qu'il peut, ne veut que ce qu'il peut, only wants or wills what he can do, et fait ce que lui plaît, only does or makes or does, acts what pleases him. And it's this vouloir-pouvoir connection, ne veut que ce qu'il peut, only wants or wills what he can do, and effectively vice versa, that affirms then a kind of constitutive correlation between willing and doing, or wanting and capacity, which is itself fairly distinctive. I don't think it's, you can find versions of this a bit in Spinoza, who I think though collapses the two together. I don't think Rousseau collapses them, but he says that they vary with each other. So the more you can do, the more you can will, and also vice versa. The more you will, the more you enhance your capacity to act, which distinguishes then willing, vouloir, from mere wishing. You can wish for all kinds of things without being able to do them. We wish, we could live forever, or there was world peace, or whatever you like. But you can only will something distinctively if you can, in principle, do it. If you have the capacity, if you're acquiring the capacity, you may not succeed, but the capacity to do what you will. That distinguishes his account of the will from, say, Descartes, whose theory of the will is more like a theory of wish, really. You can wish anything, we're like God in our capacity to wish, but the whole problem is how to link the wishing with the doing. And Rousseau connects the two, which means that he will also affirm the way that Gramsci and Trotsky and many others after will affirm, that to will the end is to will the means. As he puts it, Rousseau and Émile, whoever wills the end cannot refuse the means. And there is this constitutive relationship then between vouloir and pouvoir, between willing and doing, or will and capacity, which is itself then, and this is the crucial point, variable. So our capacity to do and to will varies, obviously, for example, in the case of Émile, with the capacity of a child as the child grows up. So an infant can do very little and effectively has virtually no will. It has a kind of proto-will, if you like. Likewise, animals, he assumes, are very limited in their capacity to do things and to will, but they have some. Likewise, so-called natural humanity, when we lived, as Rousseau speculates, in solitary isolation with absolutely minimal willpower, able to pick fruit off trees and find a place to sleep, but not much else. And as you grow up, as the child grows up, you become more capable of controlling, in all the kind of classic ways, controlling your emotions, controlling your wishes, directing your energies and efforts. But in particular, as you grow up, or as the opportunity arises, you can combine your limited individual efforts with those of other people. And the big variable then that affects our vouloir pouvoir nexus, our willing doing capacity, is our capacity to combine our efforts with other people. And when we do that, we have a qualitative shift. And this is an important point then that distinguishes Rousseau from, say, Hobbes. So Hobbes had already said, we need to worry about what people, the will of the people, essentially. We need to worry about what people want. Legitimate authority has to, in some sense, ground itself in what its constituent members want. But Hobbes assumes that what people want is peace and security, and that collectively they can do essentially nothing, because people are selfish and greedy and will stab each other in the back, quite literally. And that therefore what you need is for them to see that to get real peace and security, they should give up their capacity to act collectively and attribute all their power to a central, authoritarian figure, a sovereign, who will rule over them, precisely on the basis of their own collective incapacity. So Hobbes will say that sovereign then is authorized to govern and command everybody, absolutely, of course, precisely because they have no collective capacity of their own. Hobbes also says, though, that you can't, and this is another difference with Rousseau, is that a legitimate sovereign, then, as I'm sure you know, he lays this all out in Leviathan and on the Citizen as well, should do everything then that's required to maintain that collective submission. So keep people broadly more or less pacified in relative isolation if necessary, so that they will realize that they can do nothing to resist legitimate sovereign power, that they are literally powerless in the face of the sovereign, the majesty of the sovereign, whether that's at the level of brute force or doctrinal conformity to the, say, church doctrine or whatever it is. The crucial thing the sovereign has to do is persuade the individual by all means necessary that resistance is useless, if you like. Or if there is resistance, that they do everything required to come up with a version of the formula, come out with your hands up, basically. Submit, you can do nothing to resist. And that's grounded on the idea that people collectively are incapable of doing anything that would have some real political viability. It's also predicated, though, on the idea that Hobbes admits that you can't get inside people's heads, actually, to shape what they really will in the sense of what they actually want to do. You can intimidate them and bludgeon them into obeying commands. You can put a gun to their head and persuade them that way. But what you can't do, according to Hobbes, is get inside people's heads. He has a basically mechanical theory of the will. The will is like an appetite, which itself is a bit like a natural force, like a river moving downstream or something. You can direct it if you have the means to do so, but you can't get inside it and shape what it sincerely wants. You can't get inside people's souls, and nor do you need to, according to Hobbes. It's enough to put a sufficiently intimidating gun to someone's head to get them to do what they want. Well, Rousseau is not satisfied with either of those things. And he says we don't know basically what we can do or how far that authority to shape someone's will can go, because for two reasons, really. Because first of all, we don't know what our nature permits us to do. So he says that in Emile. Our nature is so minimal. This is one of the striking things about Rousseau's account of human nature. We have a basic instinctive love of self. We can expand that to include people that we relate to or see as similar to ourselves. We have some basic capacities which we could in principle perfect or improve over time. And that's virtually it. A couple of basic faculties, a fundamental love of self, and nothing else really. Certainly no constitutive social capacity, with this basic principle that he has in his early work, that there is no natural sociability. We're solitary animals by nature, as he imagines it, like orangutans in the woods, or animals that live essentially on their own. And that nature then doesn't tell us enough about what we're capable of. So if the key is to think, what are we capable of? What is our willing doing capacity? Well, we don't know on the basis of our nature. So it's completely wrong for people to say of Rousseau that he has some kind of idealized kind of affirmation of nature, of so-called natural man, and that he refers everything back to that kind of Edenic principle of like the sort of noble savage or happy primitive humanity. It's not at all the case. We don't know what our nature permits us to be. We can speculate, he says, that when we lived in a state of nature, we lived lives that were contented in the sense that an orangutan's life might be contented if there's enough fruit in the trees and places to sleep. But it was a stupid, limited, radically incapable existence, absolutely minimal capacity to do or will. That's what he speculates anyway. So we don't know from our nature, and we don't know either what our social capacities are in advance. All that we know is that they vary with their ability to organize, enhance, intensify, expand, or the opposite, our collective will. On the basic principle, and this is another quote worth, it's not one of my 5, but I'll give it to you anyway. Again from Emile, he says, "It's only our lukewarm will which causes all of our weakness." So we can perfectly well see that we're often weak, we're too weak to do what we want, but that doesn't self-explain why it is that we're weak. Our will is weak, but why is that? And our will can be more or less weak. We can enhance it or strengthen it. So the power of a will then, and the power then of a capacity or doing is variable. It can grow or diminish. And we don't know in advance what its limits are. We don't know them on the grounds of nature, and nor do we know what their limits are on the basis of artifice or society. So my third quote shifts us from nature to society. And it's a brief quote again from Emile, where he says, "Good social institutions are those that best know how to denature man, to denature people." Again, good social institutions are those that best know how to denature man. So again, very much against the grain of the idea of Rousseau as wanting to go back to nature. On the contrary, he accepts that we've moved out of nature, that going back isn't an option anyway, even if we wanted to. And good social institutions, so artificial, convention-bound institutions, are those that best know how to denature man, meaning to shift away from that initial primordial solitude where we lived as absolute individuals on our own with the most limited capacities then. Move away from that into this social, associated, combined, relative existence. So he goes on, good social institutions are those that best know how to denature man, to take his absolute existence from him in order to give him a relative one. And the idea is that by giving people a relative existence, by making them see themselves as part of a group in relation with other people, this qualitatively shifts our capacities, our vouloir pouvoir, our capacity to do and to will. And it makes us, he goes on in that quote, genuinely people. We become people or human in this process and not mere, quote, stupid and bounded animals. Un animal stupide et borné. It's pretty emphatic about that. And this has, and he stresses it repeatedly, a dramatic effect, a qualitative break in our capacities. I'll give you a couple of quotations. These again are not on my list and they're broadly familiar. They're from the Social Contract. He says in book 1, chapter 8 of the Social Contract, that with this transition into the state of nature, which he's outlined a couple of chapters before, something dramatic happens to people. He says, the person to who had previously just been this self-sufficient, stupid, limited animal is now part of a group. And quote, he goes on, his faculties are exercised and developed, his ideas are enlarged, his sentiments ennobled, his entire soul is elevated to such an extent, it goes on, that we would, if it wasn't for the fact that some unfortunate complications have arisen in this social arrangement, we would bless it because we have suddenly become this noble, enlarged, elevated creature whose capacities are qualitatively different in excess of what we once were as animals. And this is the thing that interests Rousseau, of course, is what is this ennobling, enlarging expansion of our capacities? How does it work? And, as you all know, it works on the basis of, how you create a social arrangement where one is truly for all and all for one, where we're united we stand, divided we fall, all of those kinds of cliches are all things that apply to Rousseau's kind of egalitarian world. And he gives, this is another quote that's not part of my list, but it's worth reflecting on and maybe retaining. He says, if you could do this fully, perfectly, of course you can't do it perfectly, but if you could, the perfect legislation, the fullest version of this social arrangement will be one in which, quote, each citizen is nothing and can do nothing except with all the others. I'll give you that again. It's from Social Contract 2:7, so book 2, chapter 7. Each citizen is nothing and can do nothing except with all the others. And just parenthetically, in case we don't come back to it, that idea that you can do nothing except with all the others is a very striking way, I think, of anticipating a certain line of thinking about what it is to be part of a trade union, say, or a political party, a kind of revolutionary political party, or this group SNCC in particular that I mentioned before, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, whose core, there's a, divisions as with all things here, but some of the most distinctive principled approaches to how that group would organize itself and constitute itself take exactly that idea. How could we organize something whereby we as individuals can do nothing except with everyone else who's part of this organization? How would you organize that? How would you sustain that? How would you distribute authority in such a way as to be consistent with that principle? That was really, it comes a lot from Ella Baker, but it's the principle that guides in particular Bob Moses, one of the key figures in this movement, and maybe we'll come back to him. Really fascinating character, I think. Some of you will know him, maybe others maybe not. At one point he would have been a very prominent figure, but I'm not sure how familiar a point of reference he is now. So Bob Moses, we'll come back to that. But this idea then, each citizen is nothing, can do nothing except with all the others. I wanted to stress that this is the kind of extreme, perfect, idealized limit of such an organization. Of course, you can't in fact do that. And it is focused on the doing and willing, which is, Rousseau is always specific. It's not that that you can do nothing at all in your life, of course, but as a member of this group, say as a member of a union or of a political party or of a movement, that as a member of the party, you can do nothing except with all the others. That's the thing that he's trying to get at, I think. So we have then with this principle that a kind of principle about the extension, if you like, the expanse or scope or material extensity of a will. And broadly, it follows a very simple principle, which is the more the better. The further you can extend, the further you can generalize a will, the more others there are that you're working with, the more you can do. So my fourth quote, again, very simple one, is, quote, the more the state expands, the more its real force increases. Just what you'd expect in a way. The more you can generalize, the more people there are in your group, the bigger the group, the wider its scope, the more you can do. So in the case of a trade union, you can organize a particular place, a factory or a school or hospital. You can then try to organize a sector. You can then try to expand across, several sectors. You can generalize further across a society or a region. You can work towards ultimately a worldwide union, right? One big union, something like that. You can work from understandings about, say, a class organization or something and build those relations of solidarity, generalize them until you reach the limit of something like a global or worldwide proletariat or something like that. Now, Rousseau doesn't have, of course, the historical imagination to anticipate things like that. He's not Marx, he can't see a global proletariat emerging or something like that. But he can understand that you can generalize a will step by step, slowly, methodically. You can expand the limits of your sphere so that you can go, and this one of his paradigmatic examples, you can go from a small little city-state in the middle of Italy to something like the big Roman Republic with all its complications as it expands, and then into an empire. And in principle, so this is about to be qualified, but in principle, the further and more general you can expand a will, the more that it can do, the more its real force increases, and the more equitable it will be as well. The more that the particularizing, divisive, class-bound interests of subgroups will tend to be overridden by this expanding, expansive general will. So he'll say in the discourse on political economy, for example, that the more you can expand this, the more powerful the general interest is in relation to particular or personal interests. And vice versa. The more you narrow things down, the more personal interests grow. And so this, he says, offers, quote, invincible proof that the most general will is also the most just. And vox populi vox Dei, that the voice of the people is indeed the voice of God, end quote. Again, fairly emphatic. The voice of the people is indeed the voice of God, meaning the voice of the most general interest. The people here defined as the actor that can sustain the most general interest, the most general will be God-like, something like, fully trans-particular, something fully general. So this fourth principle then is a principle of expansion, and left to itself, the more you can generalize, the more you can expand, the more you can do, the more you can will. So that's the first thing. And so when it's absolutely true that Rousseau looks backwards rather than forwards. So his points of reference are almost always, idealized versions of antiquity, where this configuration, the way he can exemplify it, tends to be in small, homogeneous, relatively narrow project, forms of generalization. Sparta is a classic example, but in general, the small city-state, Geneva and so on, are his paradigms. And then when he looks at places like Corsica or Poland and so on, it's still broadly from that kind of perspective. But it's not wired into the idea that the more the state expands, the more, its force grows. And he does have some counterexamples, but one of the most interesting is his account is in a political fragment of the Jewish diaspora, which I'll just read maybe briefly. There's a few sentences of this. So you'll find these in different editions. The political fragments are just kind of individual observations and quotes that weren't built into a more systematic treatise. And so I'll give you if you want to track this down, and you find them online easily enough, they're grouped into parts and like chapter and verse a bit. And it's political fragment 4, number 24. It's on page 500 in the collected works in the Pleiad. And so I'll give you a few sentences of this. He says, it's an amazing and truly unique spectacle to see an expatriate people without either location or land. And that, for Rousseau, is a very exceptional situation. His places are almost always grounded in a very specific territory. Without either location or land for nearly 2,000 years. That's also very exceptionally long for Rousseau. A people that has been modified, oppressed, mingled with foreigners for even longer. A scattered people dispersed over the earth, subjected, persecuted, scorned by all nations, and yet preserving its customs, its laws, its morals, its patriotic love, and its initial social union when all its links appear broken. In other words, a people that's really holding itself together, maintaining a collective will to sustain it. It goes on, the Jews give us this amazing spectacle. The laws of Solon, of Numa, of Lycurgus are dead. Those of Moses, far more ancient, are still alive. Athens, Sparta, Rome have perished and have no longer any children on the earth. Zion, destroyed, did not lose hers. They are preserved, they multiply, spread throughout the world. They always recognize each other. They mingle among all peoples and never become confounded with them. They no longer have leaders and are still a people. They no longer have a fatherland, but are still citizens. How strong must a legislation be to be capable of producing such marvels, capable of facing conquests, dispersions, revolutions, centuries, capable of surviving the customs, laws, dominion of all nations, which promises finally, through the trials it has sustained, to sustain them all, to conquer the vicissitudes of human things, and to last as long as the world, end quote. So that I think is very, of course, you can argue with the rendering of it, but I think as a way of understanding Rousseau's general conception of what a general will can do, how it's capable of being something more than the kind of Spartan motif that we probably usually associate with it, how it can hold up, sustain itself with all of these basic conditions removed, no contiguous territory, not homogeneous socially or ethnically, but just a common set of laws and principles and something like a general will to sustain it. That I think is worth reflecting on. So that's a way of illustrating then the principle. And in theory then, you could have something that could conquer the vicissitude of human things and last as long as the world and spread as wide as the world. So when people say Rousseau, can't imagine a situation like that, well, I don't think that's true. He can't imagine it, but it's also true that his historical imagination is anachronistic. It's oriented to the past and not to the future. I think that's undeniable. So the fourth principle then was one of extension. The more you expand, the more you generalize, the more you can do, the more the real force of the state expands with it. And the fifth and final point then, though, qualifies that. And this is probably, in a way, of the more familiar part of Rousseau, which is the part of him that says, yeah, but, and this is a principle of intensity, which is in direct tension with the principle of extension, which runs that the more you expand a will, the more you spread things out, the more you stretch that force and consequently weaken it. So my fifth quote is, this is from the Discourse on Political Economy, quote, "Interest and commiseration must in some way be constricted and compressed in order to be activated." End quote. You have to find some way to compress or concentrate, circumscribe, direct interest and general, shared sense of purpose in order to activate it. Remember, we're talking here broadly about the idea of action and what allows an action to be, in this case, then activated. You have to have something that compresses it. And there's lots of different ways of maybe framing this, but you need an event or a moment or a point or a place or a lever or a situation of some kind that crystallizes in such a way as to enable something to begin, for an action to be activated. And that broadly, this involves some kind of compression. And the dangers then being the opposite of dissipation or being spread out or dispersed, fragmented. That dispersal weakens and compression strengthens. So he goes on in this quote, this is from the Discourse on Political Economy. "It would seem that the sentiment of humanity dissipates and weakens as it spreads to the whole earth." So there, if you read that with the account then of the Jewish diaspora, we have a kind of little way of summarizing what I think is Rousseau's great lesson for us, if you like, or his great problem in a way, which is, in theory, you can have something that can spread the width of the world and last as long as the world. But as it does that, how do you avoid the danger of it dissipating and weakening? You could have a global proletariat, if you like, but how, as that global proletariat emerges, how will you deal with this problem of its sense of collective purpose being weakened and dissipated and fragmented and broken up? How do you do these two things? And it's broadly for two reasons, he says, that we have this problem. One is the way that he's understood the grounding of this, which is that you generalize from a point that is initially a limited individual point. So his whole anthropology is grounded in the primacy of the individual. The individual is concerned with its own interests, its own love of self, its own life. And you can expand out from that. You can generalize out from the individual towards other people to whom you have built a relationship. So in the Emile, it's literally to your caregivers, your parents, your people you can see in some sense as siblings or friends. And then it could expand into something more like a clan or into a city or into a small state in which you see yourself as a patriotic citizen alongside other patriotic citizens. And broadly, Rousseau's own imagination kind of runs out with that. Patriotic citizens, Romans among Romans, Spartans among Spartans. He can't really see how you could go much further. But again, that's Rousseau's problem in a way. His theory doesn't limit that, I don't think, along those ways. It's up to us to imagine other ways to see our common interests. And it's not that hard when you realize, how many common interests we materially have with other people, with all other people. So there's that broad principle. How could you find a way of generalizing out from what is initially a limited point of departure? And it's for sure true that Rousseau, the limits of Rousseau's theory, I think, are that he doesn't have very good tools for thinking about that expansion, how you could generalize further. And that's something that we have to do, I think, beyond beyond Rousseau. The second reason, though, that he says why you need to compress interest in order to activate it has to do with his account of force itself. So remember, quote number 4 was, the more the state expands, the more its real force expands. Let me just give you that again exactly. The more the state expands, the more its real force increases. So that was Social Contract 3.2, by the way, book 3, chapter 2. The more the state expands, the more its real force increases. But this force also, the more it expands, the more the force itself is diluted. So you can have more of it in extension, but less concentrated in intensity. And so the further quotation to give in this 5th point, it was a quote I almost invariably seem to cite from Rousseau. To the point of embarrassment now, and 1 or 2 people here have probably heard this dozens of times, and I always quote it, and every time I quote it, I think I should keep quoting this because it's so important to get, and Rousseau is emphatic about it. It's about the people's force, and it's Social Contract, book 3, chapter 8. And for me, it's probably the single most important thing that Rousseau says. He says, the people's force, quote, the people's force, la force du peuple, acts only when concentrated. It evaporates and is lost as it spreads, like the effect of gunpowder scattered on the ground, which ignites only grain by grain. And this whole passage is really worth reading. So it acts only when concentrated, it evaporates and is lost as it spreads. And so Rousseau's challenge to us, I think, and to anyone reading him, just comes directly from this. On the one hand, the more you can generalize and expand in extension a general will or a people or a state, all these terms broadly converge on the same idea, the more you increase the real force of that actor, the more then you can do, the more you can will. But in terms of its exercise, activation and exercise, as you do that, you dilute that force and you weaken its intensity. And so the trick is that you have to find ways then to balance these two things. The more you generalize and expand the scope of a will, the more you have to compensate for its dilution by heightening its intensity and increasing its density, if you like. And that, I'm going to stop now because I'd like to, I think it's better if we go to discussion, but that I think is a really useful way of thinking about, say, the revolutionary sequences that will follow in the French Revolution, but also the Haitian and Russian revolutions. It's a useful way of thinking about the national liberation movements. I've been thinking a bit about Fanon's work like this. There's some people, as you may know, who've been reading Fanon's a kind of creolizing of Rousseau. I think that's a very useful way of reading him, Jane Gordon in particular. I think it's a useful way of thinking about the Black nationalist current in the civil rights movement in the US, particularly the work of someone like Nikhil Singh, but a trajectory that goes from Du Bois through to Black Power, people like Stokely Carmichael, and into the Black Panthers, a way of thinking about Black nationalism, so Black Power, specifically Black Power, in a way that both intensifies or concentrates, compresses the interest of Black Power, which quite specifically, and at the risk, as happens with Snick, of excluding relations with other people, which is taking it, I think, too far. But always as a means in this tradition, still very much to say with Stokely Carmichael, of building towards a further generalization. So you concentrate the power of this particular community in order to be able to participate in a broader generalizing project that will eventually move towards something that is not limited to a particular community. In the same way that for Fanon, you consolidate the national project, the national liberation movement in Algeria, not as an end in itself that could be then co-opted by an emergent colonial bourgeoisie, but as a step and a crucial step of consolidating a power in a place that can then determine its own future and become an active, autonomous part of a Pan-African or internationalist movement. And the same can be said of Che Guevara and the Cuban Revolution and so on. So these are sequences that are concerned with how to intensify and concentrate the density of their own power, but not as separatist, ends in themselves that would close themselves off in a kind of essentialist isolation, but as contributing to a broader generalizing project. And that, I think, is what Rousseau is trying to get at. And that there's no shortcut to that work. This is the balance, trying to get that balance right. It's so easy to see the ways in which we often got it wrong, but I think it's a helpful way of sort of framing an agenda. And I'll stop with that. There's more to say, of course, but why don't I stop there?
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. One feels after that talk really very much that Rousseau is our contemporary. And I so appreciated the way in which you moved between his concerns and ours, and drew those I think very powerful links, and gave us a great deal to think about. So thank you so much for the presentation. We're now going to move into a time of discussion. Could I invite you, if you have a question to ask or a comment to make, just to write a brief version of it in the chat, and then I'll call on people in the order that those appear. And the first question, I think, is from Nick Ilbeck. So can I invite you, please, Nick, to turn on your audio and ask your question? Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This has been a very interesting conversation so far. I work with the Australian Dostoevsky Society, and we've been reading Hegel quite closely. And one of the things that we have been working with is his notion of the spirit being very general and abstract, and then the particular being very idiosyncratic to the expression within a phenomenology. But he and Dostoevsky, we believe, are working to break with the expectations and dogmas of the religion of their time. And I'm curious to what extent the will in Rousseau has been influenced by religion, specifically Calvinism. And if it has, how does something like the force of Calvinism work to concentrate the will of a people?
That's a very interesting question. I don't, the truth is I don't know really enough about Calvin to answer that properly about the specific people. But what I am struck by, because it's like a weird leitmotif through some of this kind of broadly voluntarist tradition, is something about the logic of thinking that you are one of the elect, basically, that in somehow or other you will prevail because you're one of God's instruments, that your will can be expanded from this, the way that, say, Cromwell thinks of himself as, God's instrument, but keep your powder dry all the same. But something that, say, Trotsky talks about this in relation to the Calvinists, for example. He says these are people who are convinced that history is on their side, and they move, therefore, with a kind of confidence that is not really warranted by their objective situation, that they have a kind of sense of a mission that they're fulfilling. And that sense of having a mission and being, in some sense, the vehicles for a project that's bigger than them strengthens their willpower, so to speak. And so if you can read, say, the English Revolution that way, the puritanical side of it, and it's hard, when you read the Putney debates or something, it's hard, that all the people there are trying to work out, who is really doing God's will here. And the people who can most plausibly say we are doing God's will are the ones who at a kind of basic level have the most willpower, quote unquote. I mean, that's maybe a clumsy way of putting it.
But can it be polluted by those dogmas? Just to follow up, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just wanted to know, I'm just thinking of the contemporary equivalent to Calvinism, perhaps in the US, maybe with the sort of evangelical groups forming voting blocs that have a lot of influence over US domestic politics in particular. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering how that will can be harnessed by a charismatic preacher like John Calvin or Jean Calvin, or perhaps a more contemporary figure. We can think of many, I guess, but are they able to kind of pollute that will in that way?
Well, so here we have to, it's hard to generalize, but if we stick with Rousseau a bit, Rousseau has no sympathy for the kind of charismatic oratorical manipulator, right? He's always suspicious of that, doesn't have any time for it. That's why he's suspicious really of mass deliberations, because he thinks they'll always be captured by the people who are most eloquent, the most well-connected, the most powerful, that the media basically will be co-opted by power and by wealth. And so he anticipates that pretty well and says you have to correct for that and compensate for it. So he would have those kind of little evangelical churches grouped around a kind of charismatic figurehead would not interest him, I don't think, or he would see that as just another exercise of a chief surrounded by a kind of clan or something. What would interest him though a bit is the idea of there being something like, you get this I think in some of the Quaker practices, but that there being something like, if you can tap into it, something like a common interest and thus a common will, if you can listen to it, if you can hear it, if you can basically quiet down the particular class, personal interests that obscure it and get in the way of it, if you can clear those things away and see what the common interest really is, and that there is, if you could do that, that there would be a will to pursue that and to try to achieve it. And that thinking about it metaphorically, and I don't think Rousseau himself is a religious thinker. I think when he talks about religion, it's as a social institution, civic religion to help consolidate a sense of collective purpose. You can see it in his account of the Jewish diaspora already. That religion could help you tap into that sense of collective purpose, and that you could do that in principle from an egalitarian perspective, like something like, say, a Quaker meeting where everyone's trying to listen out for this, and that I think he would have some sympathy for. And in particular, I think the idea that that there's so just going back to your original question, that idea of there being something like a trans-individual will, a will that's bigger than the will of the individuals involved, whether we think of that as the will in some sense of God, or the will of, you know, that idea of the voice of the people being the voice of God, or providence, or in Hegel's terms, you know, the will of spirit. All of those things, I think, it's helpful to think of Rousseau as debating this question, wondering how best to think about it. But where I would say he's different from the Calvinists, or from Hegel for that matter, is that he doesn't think of a collective will as participating in a will that's bigger than any human actor. That would be some sort of universal will, or the will of spirit, or the will of God in the literal sense, like providence. I think Hegel does ultimately. There's a move, you know, there are different ways in which communities, and then nations and states, and then historical moments are all feeding into a kind of theodicy, a sort of big providential sequence that's worked out at the level of world history. And that each actor, you know, at different levels are being integrated into that story. And you can see that as one side of Sartre's later work in the Critique of Dialectical Reason. You know, how can you could totalize all these purposes into a single collective purpose? And you can see that in Marx, of course. But that I think is where Rousseau parts company, and I would want to part company with Rousseau and say, no, there's no shortcut. All you have is the laborious work of generalizing out step by step from particular points, from particular communities or places or people or events or sequences. So in my Mississippi case that I'm talking about, there are a couple of moments. You know, some people sit in at a lunch counter and break the segregation rules. And that literally, the people who are involved in that or see it wake up. They talk about it saying, I woke, that Bob Moses says, the sit-ins woke me up. Stokely Carmichael says something similar. I saw this happen, and in a second, it changed something, the bounds of the possible. I could start from there. I could see that there's an action had been activated and a sequence had begun, and I could participate in it. And once you start with that, the question is, how far can you expand it? Can we expand it across Mississippi? Can we go out from this little town initially in Mississippi? Can we go into the Delta of Mississippi? From Mississippi, can we expand into the rest of the South? From the South, can we expand across the country? Across the country, can we link up with Pan-African groups and the diaspora abroad more broadly? Can we be part of a broad global anti-colonial project? Like, that's very literally the sequence that happens. And it starts with a lunch counter in North Carolina. It goes through a series of things. I don't think it's stretching it too much to say that. And it frames itself ultimately in terms of the width of the world. It really does. But it does that as a series of step-by-step generalizings, and not by tapping into some providential, overarching, divine project that you just have to, recognize. So the problem is I don't know enough about Calvin and so on to answer your question properly. But I think broadly that's what Rousseau would see. And that as you do that, you keep expanding this power that you have, but always at the risk of diluting its intensity. And you can see that he was right about that, I think.
Thank you so much, Peter. Just to add, Nick, a tiny footnote to Peter's very, very helpful answer. There's a discussion of the genealogy of the general will in Simon Critchley's book, The Faith of the Faithless, where he traces its origins from a theological term used to describe the will of God, and then how Rousseau then picks it up and modifies it, that you might find interesting. The next question was, Giovanni, please, could I invite you to ask your question or make your comment? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk that is deep and clear at the same time. I have just two questions that are in a way to criticism, but of course it's an interpretation. So how can you combine this view about expansion until reaching a kind of global universal proletarian, we could say, with the idea that Rousseau has expressed several times in the social contract that the mechanism of the general will can work properly, can function properly, only if the group is small, is not too different from the social point, like there must not be too many economic difference, but also from taste, culture, and so on one side. And also this idea, if you remember in some other parts of the social contract, that to properly vote, you should not be influenced by anyone, and in a way it creates a kind of agora when there are little individuals that have to think on their own without you remember that he says to vote properly you must stay alone and think on your own without discuss and be influenced by other group that could be a kind of set up to avoid your own freedom. And also one other comment about your idea that that you just said about he's against rhetorics, he's against the politician or religious power to seduce. But what about the elephant in the room that is the legislator? I mean, the legislator precisely must convince without persuade, must use emotions. So he really looks as a kind of obscure demagogue in a way. We know that there is a debate about that, but I'm surprised that you didn't speak about the legislator at all as a kind of figure that could really put in question your reconstruction that I really like and I think is working and it's meaningful. But yeah, okay, so these are my two cents questions. Thank you again for.
Okay, thank you, Giovanni. Those are excellent, and I'm really glad you asked them. And just to start, to go back though to the point that Chris made about going back to your question, Nick, about the other place that you could look, and I meant to say this too, is Patrick Riley has a book called The General Will Before Rousseau, which goes over some of that same territory of its theological use. So there was debates, you see them in Pascal and others, about whether, or Malebranche, whether God saves people through individual acts of redemptive mercy or as a kind of general will to save sinners, and how to some extent does Rousseau take that over. So that may, if you're on the theological side of it, that would be another place. So Patrick Riley's done a lot of work on Rousseau, R-I-L-E-Y. Okay, so those are great, yes. So one of the things that I love about Rousseau and really do like about him, and even in, and also his confessional works and so on, is that he never ducks a hard problem. So I did, I guess, by not talking about these things. I didn't mean to, actually. I just sort of ran out of time and was going to talk about at least the legislator point quickly. So he doesn't avoid the problem on both these counts. The first one, then, the problem of what to do when in an assembly you associate lots of people where there are differences of power and influence. So this is his skepticism right about Athens, is that he says it's not really a democracy. People come together, yes, but the fact is that there are patrician, noble families who dominate. And until you can correct for that, every time you have a mass gathering, that's what's going to happen. Or a mass media space, communication space, you're going to have the Rupert Murdochs of the world, etc., who will have undue influence. And the first problem is to counteract that. So I see it as I know the passages you're referring to, yes. If people should as little as possible, should try to make up their own mind, look inside themselves, see what's best for the group. And that's one side of what he's saying. The other side, though, is that he says you have to assemble. So in a properly constituted society, people assemble, they go to all the trouble required to associate, they fly to the assemblies. So he's saying, on the one hand, you have to associate, you have to find a way of associating and combining, which might still for him mean you come to the agora, you come to the common place. And one of the reasons why he's skeptical about the scale of how far you can expand a will is that he can't really imagine how you're going to do that once you are out of range. You know, if you literally have to take a horse and, you know, if you have to walk or ride there, like how can you do this in practice? So he can't really imagine how you could associate without physically coming together in a place. But he doesn't emphasize that. You have to find a way. And that, by the way, is such an interesting, well, it's just a thing that the revolutionary sequences will always have to grapple with. To what extent do you need to focus on the capital, literally the head, you know, the centering of a revolution, Paris or St. Petersburg, or the kind of critical place, the city as the central, the decisive place in which you can pitch a battle like the 10th of August, 1792, in which you can take power, you can charge the Winter Palace or something. To what extent do you need to do that, to concentrate your forces in a capital, assemble, associate? And I think Rousseau is helpful in saying you need to find some way of doing that. If you can't associate and concentrate your force, you will be, you will be overcome. You just won't be able to overcome the things, the resistances that you face, which are the resistances of the forces that will tend to undermine association and assembly. So the powers he associates basically with the rich. The rich can disperse, they can scatter, they control the media broadly, and you need to find a way to overpower the power of the rich, basically. So how can you do it? And I think there is a tension. I don't think Rousseau has solved this problem, but I think what he's broadly saying is something like first you need to combine and associate somehow or other. And second, you need to do it in such a way that truly respects the individual opinions of all the people associated. So it's not, I don't think he solved how to do this, but those would be the criteria. What would it mean truly to listen to every person so that one person, one vote really means something? Or again, in my SNCC example, these were people who were contesting what had become an effective model or somewhat effective model, which was the top-down pulpit-oriented model, the Martin Luther King model that had come out of the boycott. And I don't want to get too stuck in the history here, but because I know it won't be necessarily so familiar, but you'd had in late 55 or 56, this bus boycott in Montgomery, been quite successful, but it worked in a conventional way with charismatic, media-friendly leaders, you know, Martin Luther King and other ministers who were used to leading from the pulpit. Martin Luther King is explicit about this. Power comes from the pulpit down to the pew, and you speak from the place of the pulpit, from above, you know. And God, Martin Luther King was tremendously good at it. But what SNCC is trying to do is to say, but how can you assemble and combine people such that an illiterate sharecropper in Mississippi can have a voice at the same level in the same argument with Martin Luther King, who's super educated, incredibly eloquent, has every word at his disposal, has the media, you know, hanging on his every word now. How can you do that? And it was a genuine question. They struggle with the ways of trying to do this, and arguably they don't succeed, but they understand that that's the issue. And Rousseau anticipates that problem, and maybe he leaves it as an unresolved tension. You have to assemble and associate, but you have to do it in such a way that respects each individual opinion, including those of the least entitled, the least authorized, the least eloquent, the least charismatic, all that. And I think he at least poses the question. And the further thing that you have to supplement that business about him saying, you know, everyone should deliberate as if on their own, but nevertheless with everyone else, are those things where he says, you know, no one can do anything except with others, my previous quotations. And also his account of voting, I think it's book 4, chapter 2, where he says, okay, you do this, you have a deliberation, you're assembled, you associate, you discuss what has to be done. And as that happens, you see a consensus starting to emerge, right? So the example for me would be, the obvious one would be something like a union deliberating about whether to go on strike or not. You know, a lot of us have had that experience repeatedly. And so people argue and debate, and maybe it takes a while, maybe it takes months. Arguably, it could take years really to arrive at a point where the consensus starts to emerge that, let's say, we should go on strike. Some examples there, they're really great examples of this, I think, in the sort of forms of social deliberation in Bolivia back in the moments around the so-called water wars in Cochabamba, and then the gas wars in El Alto, and so on. The descriptions of how people arrived over years of discussion and deliberation about what to do about these neoliberal, quote unquote, reforms that were just, expropriating public resources, and how they arrived at a situation where eventually they could reach a consensus decision that most people subscribed to, that they would confront these things and stop them happening, which meant confronting the army, which meant a showdown straight up with the government. Eventually it meant overthrowing the government and replacing it. And likewise, you can imagine with people being part of a union that's a bit discouraged and beaten down. We're not really ready to strike. We don't go on strike. We wait. We go on strike, but half-heartedly. It doesn't really work. But over a year or two, people arrive at the decision that, okay, now we're going to go on strike, and we're going to do it properly. We're going to organize it properly. We're going to combine with other unions. And this is the view that comes to prevail. And then in a situation like that, Rousseau asks explicitly, what do you do when you realize that your view, let's say you oppose the strike, or you think it's not realistic or it's counterproductive, you realize that your view is losing the argument, and that the prevailing view is, no, we should go on strike now. And he says, at that point, you have to see, you have a decision. Basically, either you stick to your guns and dissent, and ultimately perhaps leave the union or abandon it or argue against it, or you rally around and accept that the general will of this group as it emerges and as it's becoming clear is more important than your initial view, and then you need the discipline to submit to the view of the group, right? So you have to, a lot of what he calls virtue is just that, is the ability to see that collective discipline is more important than your personal opinion, and really is more important. In other words, that you can see that for the group to survive, for the union to thrive and to move forward and so on, you're going to have to align yourself with its decision, even if it wasn't your personal view, at least initially. And again, that's a very helpful way of dramatizing or thinking about what happens to revolutionary organizations, or a group like SNCC, which for a while was able to do that and at a certain point lost that ability. And again, you can see that happen over and over. And I think what Rousseau is good at is just saying there's no shortcut to that. There's no like mystery answer. It's a tension, it's a problem. You're going to have to work out a way to solve it. And you could argue the Bolshevik party, say, solved it for a while and then lost its ability to solve it. You could say the same thing about the Jacobins. You could say the same thing about lots of different organizations, I think. But I like the way Rousseau just lumps it on us as a problem. Sorry, that was a very long answer. The second thing about the legislator. Yes, of course, you're right. The legislator. So, there's a little short list, right, of things that people always wheel out to attack Rousseau for, forcing people to be free, and then the legislator is probably right up there, the list, the manipulative demagogue, as you say, behind the scenes, pulling the strings. And of course, you can read it that way. And there's the legislator, there's the educator, the tutor in Emile, there's Mr. Volmar in the novel, Julie. But I don't really see it that way. Again, I think he likes also to be as provocative as possible in some of his phrases. But what he's doing is taking seriously the idea that you can't put the cart before the horse, basically. That in a situation in which people are not yet able to act collectively, they haven't yet found the basis for a kind of common purpose. They haven't yet worked out a kind of constituent assembly that's decided on their rules and so on. What you have instead are people who are not yet in that position. So people who are, again, if you remember from that part of the social contract, is book 1, chapter 6, it's incredibly minimal, his account of how people form the initial association. He just says, I assume people have reached a point where they can't go on as they were before, meaning broadly anarchy, class tension, people fighting each other, impasse. And they say, okay, we can't go on like this. We have to combine and associate and work out some new arrangement. But what Rousseau doesn't accept is that you could just, with the resources you have in that moment, draw out what you need to work out what that arrangement would be. In other words, he doesn't think that you have primordial, basic human social capacities that could just draw on their own, self-sufficient guidance to work out what needs to be done to start this new political process. Something else has to happen. There has to be a threshold crossed. There has to be a kind of triggering moment a moment in which you have an educator, to use Marx's old phrase, educating the educator, in which there is indeed an educator who helps facilitate a break or open a door or widen an imagination or something like that. In the case of the SNCC example I'm giving, it would be someone like Ella Baker, who really performs that role. Or in the case of, say, the Bolshevik sequence, that the party really saw itself as that it was drawing on Marx's authority and so on. It was providing something that left to themselves people were not yet able to do, drawing on their trade union type experience or their experience as workers, that by itself was not sufficient. So you can certainly argue with this, but that's Rousseau's broad view is you need some supplement. You need an enabling figure or moment or lesson or teaching or something like that. He calls it the legislator. The question is it a demo? So you can first of all argue, is that right? Is it helpful? I think it is helpful if you understand it in very minimalist terms as a kind of sort of vanishing mediator that helps initiate a process that's part of this kind of qualitative shifting, expanding a capacity. That there's something about all of that is, as he emphasizes in the chapter on the legislator, which is 2.7, I think, right? That is exceptional and transitory and temporary. And I think there's something valuable in that, and that what is just as striking about it, just to wrap that, it's two things that are striking about it. One is that he invests this figure then with the authority and the capacity to speak to the political equivalent of children, remember? And he does that in a way that you can easily condemn as kind of elitist or obnoxious, but he's doing it because he's assuming that people are not yet members of a collective, right? They've just decided that they should be, but they don't yet know how to do it. So they don't yet have that capacity. They remain minimally capable. Their willing and doing remains very limited. So they need some kind of education that's appropriate for their state of development, so to speak. It's the political equivalent of educating a child. I think that's actually pretty explicit in the way that it's formulated. So the legislator is that person who knows how to tell a story to children, essentially. And what is that? It's Moses with his tablets, it's a bird speaking into your ear, it's some miracle, it's like a thing that allows you to tell a nice fable to political children. And if it was designed to keep them as children, if it was like, okay, and now I'm going to maintain that position of hierarchy and I'm going to guide you like the equivalent of children, like a prophet through the desert, well, then it would be a pretty obnoxious theory. But the other side of it, of course, is that the children grow up. And Rousseau emphasizes just as much the idea that the person who's got that way of speaking to children will then leave the scene as quickly as possible. So you start the process, you trigger it, you provide some laws, you provoke, you give some basic rules, and then you leave. And so he's just as insistent about that. The legislator is the person who does that, triggers that process, helps the child grow up, so to speak, and then abandons the terrain, cannot inherit the position of then teaching the adolescent or the adult, let alone, can't be the leader, has no mandate for that, has to leave, in fact, has no mandate at all. And that's, I think, quite striking and interesting, very different than from the party logic. The educator here is that person who is indeed an educator, has to play an exceptional role in order then to eliminate their function, to leave, literally to go into exile, to have no further role. And that's the way that, again, the SNCC people think of themselves as organizers. They recognize that in Mississippi, again, as it stands, something needs to break. People have been beaten down. They've been very intimidated. The history of violence is absolutely horrific. And, and it has largely stifled political, emancipatory projects again and again. People have been killed. And there's this moment where the youth comes in, and it's now the youth, by the way, that would play this role of the legislator. These young students come in full of idealism and hope and so on, and a kind of reckless courage. And you get again and again in the stories of it, people saying, I've been waiting for you for decades. I've been waiting for you my whole life, some people say. There's these stories of people in their 70s or 80s, sharecroppers and so on, saying to a student coming from out of state or coming from another part of the state, I've been waiting for you for 80 years, And you then are this legislator figure who, with the mixture of your courage and your kind of clarity, combined with our organization and our sense of collective capacity, are going to help change the balance of power here, going to change the balance of what's possible. You make it possible to activate a sequence. We can start a voter registration campaign. We can start a campaign for a new kind of political party. And once that process is activated and underway, you will leave. You will go your own way. We will, you know, become full citizens in this place, and we will work out what we want to do. And we will not need you anymore. We need you now, it's true, to help initiate a process that's been stifled. And that's the situation we're in. We appreciate that. And then thank you very much, on your way. And that's broadly what happens. And the legislator then is that figure, right? They do their work and they leave. And the other thing that's then striking, just to finish, is that this word legislator, legislator, is ambiguous because it refers to this figure, the lawgiver, is translated often into English, who's exceptional and indeed a demagogue. Although we should ask ourselves why demagogue is a leader of the people, or why that word has got all its associations with it. But demagogue, okay. But then legislator is specifically what the people themselves become, because who exercises legislative power, who is sovereign? Well, it's the people. And the people were always sovereign from the beginning. It's just that they were sovereign in this very limited capacity. It was minimal. And now through the work opened up by the legislator, they can acquire step by step, you know, something that is more like a real sovereign capacity, a real power to command. And as they do that, the legislator is them. And the original triggering figure is gone. And so I think that's a sort of an account of an avant-garde that accepts that you need an avant-garde in any kind of army sort of metaphoric situation. You're going to have a front line somehow or other. There's no way around it. And that vanguard has some specific tasks in the way that other parts of an army have tasks. A vanguard is a vanguard because it's part of a broader thing. A vanguard on its own is not a vanguard. It's a usurper or a tyrant or a despot, and Rousseau is very clear what he thinks about them. And then once a vanguard has done its job, it can be absorbed back into the broader army, or it can leave. It's done its job. And so I think Rousseau just lays out that problem and said, this is a problem. It's also a danger. The danger of the legislator that you're talking about, I think, is the one that he confronts explicitly with the danger of government. What you do with the fact that you need a government, a people, in order to affirm its general interest, has to overcome the interests of the particular groups, the rich, the powerful, the dominant, the ruling class, basically. It has to have the power to do that. To concentrate that power, it needs to act, you know, collectively and forcefully. And it needs a government that can act on its behalf, that is itself sufficiently concentrated and powerful to do the work that is required to overcome the rich, for example. And the danger then posed, and Rousseau's emphatic about it, is that government becomes, I think what you're saying, might be implicit in the logic of the legislator, which is the government will usurp power from the sovereign, and the government will take over, and the government will become a permanent demagogue, or a kind of a sort of party that will rule as a substitute for the class or for the people. And Rousseau says this is indeed an absolute danger. And in fact, it's what will inevitably tend to happen unless you stop it from happening. And because he's pessimistic about it, he says, and in the end, you're not really going to succeed in stopping it happening. But it's not because he doesn't see it as a danger, he does.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you, Giovanni. We have 3 more comments in the chat. I'd love to be able to get through them all. We've got just shy of 15 minutes, so we'll do our best. Could I please invite Karen Green to intervene next? Thank you.
Hi, thanks. So I kind of always am a bit disappointed that people don't take the opportunity of actually, you know, when they talk about Rousseau, mentioning the fact that at least as a political theorist, he does have a place for women. I think it's unfair just to call him a misogynist. But I think when you think about the place that he gives to women in terms of motivating men towards virtue and et cetera, I think an idea that he gets from Madeleine de Scudéry, but that's beside the point. It does sort of raise some problems for your claim that there is nothing to the idea of Rousseau as the lover of some sort of, you know, natural man. And I mean, you start Emile. God makes all things good. Man meddles with them and they become evil. He forces one soil to yield the products of another, one tree to bear another's fruit. He confuses and confounds time, place and natural conditions. And, this place that women have in his role, in his philosophy rather, is very much, when they're the bad women, they're the ones who stimulate their amour de soi, amour propre, and lead to inequality. But then there's the natural woman who understands that her place is to teach men to love virtue, and it's this virtue. I mean, in a way, this idea, I think, of the common good has to go back to there being a single good, which is sort of God-given. I mean, there's the stuff in about nature, God having given us a conscience. I can't have forgotten the exact figure, but written the words that we know on our soul, of conscience on our soul, given us this inner sense. So that so you can have this idea of the common of the general will being, in a sense, the Christian community of souls all doing that God-given good thing that we know. So I just think that when you sort of look at this idea that he has of women's natural role and the inner knowledge that we have somewhere hidden underneath of what is good, it's just very, very clear that that he does believe in man's good, God-given nature.
Yeah, I know what you mean, but I don't entirely agree. And so I'm trying to, in the sense that he does agree that, so our nature on its own terms is good, yes. Certainly it's convenable, it's appropriate. So a creature concerned with its well-being, its amour de soi, in a natural environment like the one he sort of speculates that we might have grown up in, a primordial forest which has everything you could possibly want, kind of condition of natural abundance, no scarcity, etc. That's convenable and good, appropriate in that sense. But when you say what we know, like the divine goodness that we kind of in some way know, what is that tacit knowledge or conscience? So conscience, and I'm not going to be able to demonstrate it now, and I haven't worked on it for a little bit, but that I know what you mean. And so I think it'd be really worth looking at the exact formulations of how he talks about conscience, and whether when he talks about conscience, he's referring to something like a transhistorical, basic, natural, kind of whispering voice of God that any human being could just tap into if they could listen properly and silence the distraction, which might be nurtured, say, by loving family relationships or by a kind of things that would nurture our kind of, let's say, our more caring side, or however you want to put it. Whether that's what he means, or whether he means something that is cultivated through something like a patriotic sense of collective purpose. In other words, conscience is something you acquire as a member of a society, which itself is, of course, artificially instituted and represents this qualitative break. In other words, conscience would be a moral capacity we acquire like virtue in ways that are irreducibly extra-natural. Not that they have no relation to nature. They are grounded always and motivated in some sense by our amour de soi, and that you can only work with the people that you have. They're only individuals who can will and who have desires and capacities. But that this idea of social institutions that denature man, he's emphatic about that, I think, and that the Spartan or the Roman who really identifies the Roman Sparta has a conscience as a Roman. So Brutus killing his sons, is doing what is required, what his conscience as a Roman requires him to do. But it's not what any parent would like to do, any mother or any father would want to do as a parent, right? And I think he does emphasize that capacity to acquire that is what gives you a conscience, and that you can trust your inner voice when the public voice is strong. And I think you can make an argument then, although I can't do it now, but for showing that when the public voice is corrupted, when you're not sure what Rome is, when everything is corrupt and chaotic, and which is to say, in the bulk of human history, in fact, almost all of human history, for the reasons you say, that man has made everything bad, that's absolutely right. Most of human history is like that, corrupted by property and inequality and so on. Then your inner voice doesn't tell you what to do. Your inner voice might say, get what you can, or pursue your private interest, or might be disoriented. I think the inner voice is clear when the public voice is clear. When Rome is strong, Brutus knows what to do. When the union is strong, so to speak, or the party is strong, then as a member, a disciplined member of that party, you might know what to do. And when it weakens and is dissipated and broken and riven by factions, then I think your inner voice won't tell you necessarily what to do. And I think that I think Rousseau is saying there, and in a situation like that, to cultivate virtue is to cultivate the discipline of the collective interest in a way that might be, very difficult or very challenging, and certainly is shot through with a kind of virile set of thematics. I mean, I personally don't object to that too much, just like I think there are quite a lot of feminist writers who will talk about the importance of manliness in the 19th century, for example, and without any worries about the gendering of that quality. Manliness means something like courage and strength and the capacity to fight and so on. And of course, a lot of the suffragettes say will applaud this and embrace it. And some of Rousseau's kind of virile virtue thematics is just that, I think, the courage, the capacity to fight, virs coming out of strength. So I don't personally think, I just admit, I think his misogyny is pretty obnoxious, and there are a lot of things about Rousseau that I think are kind of obnoxious, but I don't, I'm not going to try to, I don't really feel, I don't know, I still wonder a little bit about how far that compromises his core intuitions. I don't think they do very much. But anyway, I guess that's all I would say about this conscience question. I think it's a really good one though, and I can see why you would raise that point, and when you can make a case for saying that conscience is something extra social, or that taps into a kind of a dimension of his philosophy that is more fundamentally oriented by nature. I can see a case for that. And someone I draw on a lot, Robert de Raté, argues against that a little bit in his work. But that going back to the 50s. I haven't looked at the recent literature on it. But I'm guessing, unless someone's done it already, that something focused on the question of conscience and its relation to nature would be really worth doing. I mean, maybe you've already done it. But if not, it would be worth doing, I think.
Well, Peter, thank you so much. We've got two comments in the chat to get through. I'm really keen to get through them both. If we could, Lucian, could I invite you to speak next, please?
Oh, yes. Thank you, Peter and Chris. I was just interested in the idea of the river metaphor, and I know you mentioned that as the force expands, the more there's the possibility of being diluted is yes. So I suppose that answers the question from earlier, but I was wondering if you could expand on that, please.
Well, I wonder if was it a reference to Hobbes though, and the river, possibly,
yes.
Which he does talk. He used that metaphor a couple of times when he's arguing about free will with different people, and he says, but it goes against. He says, it's a bit more like Spinoza. When a stone falls to the ground, does it will to fall to the ground? We maybe could assume that if a stone could think, that's what it thinks it's doing, but it's just falling because it's being caused to fall. And likewise, the river, when it rushes downhill, or when it turns left to go around a mountain or something, it's just following the course of the causal powers that are affecting it. So Hobbes's point is that the will is really just like that. The causal pressures on you, the appetites and forces and impulses, work on you essentially in a mechanical way, and the strongest ones will prevail. And the ones that when you deliberate, when you free yourself, as he likes to think of it, from the arguing about which one should prevail, what happens in that moment of willing the course of action is just that the strongest appetite prevails. The course that pushes the river one way or another takes over. And Rousseau is different in that sense, and this is where, again, I think he he's not himself comfortable with these kinds of natural metaphors. It'd be more like you build, and this is terrible, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, but it's not so much that there's a river and that you can contribute something into it and it can grow and it can expand and become more forceful. You're making me think of another sequence in SNCC, which I'll come to in a second. It's more that you can build an aqueduct, so to speak. You can collectively put your energies together and get water to a place where it's not naturally, or something like that. You could build something to make it possible for a city to drink and feed itself and so on, even if that's quite unnatural. You could build an artificial river. And you could do that with the engineering and the capacity, and that would allow you to sustain yourself as a city. And it's not because nature does it for you, you know. So there's something artificial about this idea that the best social institutions are those that denature man. I think that's a helpful way of seeing it. This, just parenthetically, and I know as we're running out of time, in SNCC there was an argument about a metaphor. Bob Moses says at one point, he says, we're like a ship in the ocean that has to rebuild itself in the middle of the ocean without sinking. How do you do that? We're a ship, you know, you take the planks apart, we're gonna sink. But we need to take the planks apart because we're in an ocean that we're adrift, and the situation is a crisis, and you know, and we're grappling with this problem. And the ocean means we're not going anywhere by ourselves. We're just in the ocean. We're kind of adrift. We got to figure out our own line of action. I really like this metaphor. And his rival at the time, James Foreman, they're kind of this battle for the soul of the organization, says, no, we're not on an ocean. I don't really like this metaphor. We're on a river, and the river is taking us somewhere very clear. We got to find a way of navigating the rapids. We have to have a tight ship, basically, to avoid getting dashed on the rocks. But we can be confident about the movement of change and the movement of history. It's an argument a bit more like you might find in Marx and Lenin and others, who are confident about the movement of history. We're moving with the current. And you know this Benjamin quote that says, you know, the big mistake that, this is in this thesis on history, the big mistake the working class made in the 1920s and 30s was this confidence they were moving with the current, that history was on their side, that they were going with the flow of things. And all they needed was a tight ship able to bang into a few rocks without sinking. And you know, that would be ugly perhaps, but that they would wind up going in the direction of progress. And Rousseau doesn't have that. Big difference between Rousseau and Marx says Rousseau does not have any historical optimism. There's no river that's taking us somewhere. The river of time, if anything, is a river of corruption and decadence. And unless you deliberately, voluntarily correct for it, then history itself doesn't offer anything, apart from occasional examples of what's possible to do in excess of history by going against the grain of history. Again, like the Roman, you know, virtue example or something like that. And this will come up again in the French Revolution. So, yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. Lillian, you've been waiting extremely patiently. Please, could I invite you to ask your question now?
Yeah, thank you. I actually have a lot of questions now, now that like so many other questions have been raised, and I wish we had more time, but unfortunately we don't. So the last things you mentioned, thank you for the presentation. The last things you mentioned about these metaphors of the ship and the river and these things also, I mean, it kind of just reminded me of Michel Serres' solution of like Michel Serres' critique of Rousseau in the natural contract, and also like the kinds of metaphors he introduces, like next to like us as humanity, like being a ship, to like us being also like an ocean or ice caps or something like that. So he kind of, this is, I guess, like one part of his critique of Rousseau, naturalizing the metaphor of humanity towards something which itself is like liquid and fluid and has to be canalized and well, is itself understood in like kind of naturalist terms. So yeah, this is just like, I guess, a kind of comment, and I'd also be interested in whether Michel Serres' like ecological reading of Rousseau plays any role for your reading. And then the other question which arose for me quite at the beginning, I would be interested, and this is also what I posted in the chat, in the ontology of the force, and like the idea that as well, movements become more global or bigger, they kind of also, they're also at stake to dissipate and losing strength. And I was wondering whether this kind of ontology or like of ontology of the force is bound to, on the one hand, like the idea that the will is directly connected to a territory, and then like, of course, like as bigger a movement becomes, like it's hard to control it. So whether this plays a role, and then how does that shine a light on contemporary movements with like different communication techniques? So like it's possible to communicate on a global scale through, I don't know, like what we have, like internet. And do you think it's the same ontology of forces that are, well, at stake here? If there's another kind of inhabiting space or using space or communicating over big distances. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lillian. Chris, what is the time frame? When you say we don't have time, are you about to go to something else?
Or is no, I'm just aware of your own time and everybody else.
Okay.
So if you're at leisure to answer the question,
I'm at leisure until
then please do go ahead.
I have another 15 minutes or so if that's useful, but I don't want to keep, if everybody else has, I don't know what your own schedule is. I know it's probably the end of a long day. But
I'm very happy to keep the meeting running until you've answered fully. And if anyone needs to go there, of course, very welcome to do that.
Okay, great. Well, then I can go certainly till what would be 11 my time, so 20 minutes or so. And I know, yeah, there's a lot of expertise here about Michel Serres, and I'd be interested to know what you think about that, Chris. And I think it's a really good question, Lillian. So the truth is, I haven't looked at Serres for a while, and his critique of Rousseau. So I don't, on one level, I don't know. I need to go and look at that, and that's a nice reminder. And the different books about, racial, sexual, natural contracts, I think are all really helpful ways of kind of directing lines of criticism at Rousseau. In the overall, so. Yes, I guess overall, I think that there is a real difference here between broadly a kind of naturalizing approach that sees human beings and human capacities as in some sense mediated by their natural basis, which you would get, I think, in broadly Serres, but again, I don't know really his work well enough, certainly in Deleuze or in a kind of broader naturalistic approach. I think in Spinoza too, that there's a play of forces and a kind of radical naturalism of the sort that Deleuze likes to embrace. And human forces and capacities are part of that broader fabric, and it's complex and folded and ramified and so on. And so one of the things you need then as a kind of actor or figure in the midst of that is a capacity to navigate your way through this complexity. And Serres is very eloquent as a figure of kind of finding your way through complex water. And I think there is a fundamental difference between that broad approach, where you would marshal your capacity to read the landscape, to know, to be able to read your place in nature and see that complex set of relationships and navigate your way through it, find a way through it. And what Rousseau's talking about, which is something that insists more on a kind of qualitative break, I think, between the social and natural, between the deliberate and the undeliberate, between the voluntary and the sub or non-voluntary, and that wants to enhance then that capacity to broadly something like, again, if not build an aqueduct, find your way across open waters where you need tools for doing that. You need navigation equipment. You need to read the star. I don't know. Maybe I don't have the right metaphor really. To find your way though across an expanse that doesn't itself orient you, where, of course, if you know how to get yourself across an ocean, there's lots of things to orient you, but where there's not the same kind of thing as just drawing on a reading of the landscape, say, or finding your way through a kind of actor networked type complex space, but more carving out your own sense of capacity to kind of drive a way through it, a little bit more in line with the kind of voluntarist sort of idea that there's there is no path, that we make the path by walking it, you know, that we, Machado's poem, or which you get versions of this idea that it's the determination to find a way that makes it, you know, where there's a will, there's a way, that kind of idea. And that without that will, there is no way. It's not that it's there, you know, that you could read and find your way through the thicket of things if you had sufficiently attuned reflexes, say, and eyes to see, and you know, a heightened sense of awareness about the world and about nature and its complexities. That cultivating all of that, which might well be good in itself, will not find a way through the political thickets that we're in. That you need instead to marshal a different set of resources, which are essentially social and artificial or conventional in that sense, deliberate, grounded in the exercise of collective will, so to speak, and sustained by their own integrity, and that allow you then to kind of push a way through. And that would be, I think, certainly different from, say, what Deleuze is offering, closer to someone like Badiou. Chris and I have had this kind of argument before, and maybe we're about to have it again. And I can see the value of both positions, but I think what Rousseau is offering is something more like that. Or maybe, and this goes back to Karen's point, he's interesting because you can read him either way. There is a way that you can read Rousseau as a philosopher of nature, of course, and oriented by something like what is appropriate for human beings, given our nature and so on. But I don't think I don't think he has much to offer that way of reading, really. I think his account of nature isn't very useful or helpful, but he does have a lot to offer, accounts of kind of militant emancipatory organization. But I would be curious to know what other people think, or what, yeah, don't mean to put you on the spot, Chris, but I imagine you have a version of that question also. Or what, Lillian, what you think?
Lillian, would you like to reply?
Well, yeah, thank you for this answer. Yeah, this point that you made with like you have to well, the path has to be like invented somehow. It's not there. Yeah, I think, yeah, this is, I guess, yeah, the kind of core of what you also presented before, and also, well, because I tried to like kind of link it back to my question of like, what does it tell us about an ontology of force? And I guess it's kind of sort of like a what one might call trans-individual assemblage of forces. It reminded me a bit of like what we might also find in Balibar, but this is how I understood it. And yeah, I guess for me, this is also still like an open question with this like topic of forces, how this also links to kind of history and philosophy of science in some sense, because like Rousseau also talks from a certain historical moment, and the way the forces of rivers or hydrodynamics or all these things have been perceived. So but this is like still an open question for me, how this is also in a context, and how it might have been shifted now and reflects back on social movements. So yeah.
Yes,
a bit what
okay.
I thought here.
Right, so I realized I didn't answer that part of your question. And I don't know, again, if I have a proper answer to it, but so a couple of things to add. One is that it is remarkable, you know, Rousseau's point of departure is a skepticism about the capacity for science and scientific progress and artistic refinement and so on to solve our problems. So his early discourses, you know, which are genuinely scandalous in the midst of the Enlightenment, you know, in terms of their context, they have this iconoclastic kind of breaking consensus quality, which is the cultivation of our knowledge of these things will not guide us by itself. You know, that we can't, it won't be like some scientific illumination that will tell us how we should find that path, you know, that we're going to have to instead organize a kind of force to push its way through and find a path for natural, you know, for equality and freedom, which itself will correct natural inequalities. So the work, you know, the natural way of things is always to increase inequality. Left to itself, the run of things, la force des choses, I think he puts it, will tend to increase inequality. It will tend to increase social divisions. It will tend to corrupt institutions and so on. So the work, an energy of effort should be to correct that and go against the grain. So this is where, again, he's more like Badiou or Benjamin or others who say the work of politics is to go against the grain of things, against the current of time, or against the natural order of things, or against the movement of history. He's not, in that sense, he's really not like Marx, who can think that history is advancing even if it's advancing on its bad side. So that's one thing. Then the question of forces and the ontology of forces, yeah. So, I mean, the optimistic part of me would say, Rousseau, if you could see how our capacities for assembly and association and combination have expanded, because we don't have to go to the agora anymore. We don't have to, walk from our field into the town and be there. We can assemble in all these different ways, virtually, etc. We have a capacity to see, in principle, how we have common interests just by dint of being alive on this planet. And we've taken these pathetically inadequate, but nevertheless real steps. Even the Paris Accords, is a step in that direction by saying, well, we do share a climate and there should be some kind of idea of equity, even if it's nothing like enough, etc. And you can see in the emerging, say, climate strikes, or again, a pretty interesting case of a thing that starts arguably, with a big backlog history, but nevertheless, a kind of threshold crossed, by one person or several small groups of people, which can trigger a thing, which can expand, which can spread, and where all those questions of how far and at what cost and how diluted, etc., are all being asked. But you can at least imagine something that says that it's a properly global issue. Obviously, it's a single climate, it affects everybody. It affects them, though, unequally and unevenly. And confronting that unevenness and inequality is essential. And that you do that best by harnessing local power that is rooted in a kind of territory, I think, in a particular place, defending a particular thing, mobilizing specific groups of people for specific struggles, around defending this place, that river, blocking this pipeline, holding this ground. I mean, I often think of the tension you get in someone like Edward Said's work, where there's a side of him that celebrates this sort of Deleuzian movement, exile, nomadic quality. But in the issues around Palestine in particular, he will always come back to the idea that you have to hold your ground. If you're in a struggle like the struggle that defines Palestine, the issue is, can you hold your ground, and do you have the power to hold it? And he will have articles with the titles like, "The problem is our powerlessness. We don't have the power to hold our ground, and that's why we're being bulldozed into oblivion." And this happens repeatedly. So I think in both political and environmental terms, that question of, do you have the power to hold your ground in the place where you are? Have you mobilized enough people? Have you found the way to do that? Typically by expanding then your extension. A small group of people defending a little tiny patch of ground will not be able to do very much. But a small group of people defending a little patch of ground that's tapping into a much wider thing that can establish sort of chains of equivalence across lots of different struggles, that can be totally transformative. And that can start with something very small. And so there's no reason, I think, why the climate strikes couldn't be absolutely transformative, really genuinely revolutionary, if they acquire that capacity to force that through. And that everything to play for there, right? We I don't know. And the question with ontology of forces, would that be fundamentally, though, different from what Rousseau is basically talking about, which is combine, organize, channel, discipline, force through, or will it be qualitatively different? I mean, do you think something has happened, apart from the technological things that make it much easier to do that, has that fundamentally changed? Will the general interest of everyone prevail over the class interests of a few, for example? Do you have time? What do you think that, when you say the ontology, what has changed, in fact, apart from just the scale of things?
Well, thanks for the answer. I think you really nailed what I was interested in. I don't know if others see that as well, and you, but don't you think there's something has shifted when we, for instance, organize global climate strikes, which do not come from a very local well, demand or a local perspective of a river or something like from which it grows, but really like starts off from a global interest. This is like, yeah, this is one thought I have, whether this is really still the case of this like growing from a local to a global, or whether we have changed the perspective. And then the other thing is also, I mean, especially like with the Palestine-Israel question, and now like I'm in Berlin at the moment, and there have been so many protests here, and well, it's like at another like place, and even though of course like Germany is like kind of entangled in the history, it's still like somewhere else, and it does not start off from this local problem, but it is like kind of displaced. So I would see a difference here, but maybe, well, maybe you see it differently. Yeah.
Well, but I think the question is always one of linking the local and the more general, and the issue is precisely if that relationship is either collapsed to a point or expanded so far that it becomes an abstract, universal, empty, cosmopolitan position. You know, so if you only organize around global warming in a very general sense, without holding your parliament in Sweden or in Iceland or in Germany or anywhere else to account, or holding your school and your friends in your class in your particular place to account. So, for example, again, to go back to my SNCC case, which is just in my mind, you know, they're talking about civil rights, which are in themselves very general. You could argue that they're just human rights, and in that sense abstract, but they're very specifically rights that are contested in a Jim Crow place, specific laws of segregation, that then become very focused. This lunch counter in a particular restaurant, or this school that excludes a student because she went on a strike yesterday, or tried to register to vote with someone and was arrested or something. And then a moment where the 100 or so friends of that person in that school all walk out together and stop that school from expelling her, you know, a very local thing, where then all the parents of those kids and those teachers and those people get in basically a fight about it, which is both very local, but also very general, because what's at stake are basic human issues, you know, that relate to broadly universalizable rights. It's just that they're not being universalized here. And likewise, when Greta Thunberg and others are talking about, you know, at least I think what will make the climate strikes and the, you know, Extinction Rebellion type actions effective is if they are able to really make this link concrete, so that it's not just a matter of saying abstractly we would like, you know, to keep global warming emissions down such and such, or to keep to 1.5 degrees, or these targets which are very general, very diluted in terms of their immediate impact on people or corporations or governments, that can be delayed and deflected into the future, that can be evaded one way or another. If those things go from that to a very concrete step, you know, about right now, right here, what are you going to do and how are we going to force you to do it? And that will convert those things into, I mean, you can start, maybe it's starting to happen with illegal rulings against Shell and others last week. And you can imagine the kinds of steps that would have to be took. And there are definitely steps in that direction. And it is remarkable to have demands that are framed that way. But I'm not sure it's unprecedented. Like when people were making the anti-colonial or civil rights type demands, they were being couched in universal terms. They were terms, or even when the French Revolution declares its rights of the citizen and of man, they're always, you know, both locally, like this is what's happening right now in Paris as we are asserting this will for justice, basically. And they are projecting out into what should be the case for all of humanity. And each of those great revolutions in France and Haiti and Russia, one of the things that's striking about them is that they don't see themselves as the French Revolution. They see themselves as the revolution that happens to be taking place in France, but that is a revolution for the world, and whose internal logic and ambitions is oriented that way. I mean, it's very explicit in the Haitian and Russian cases too, right? The Russian Revolution happens to be happening in Russia, but the whole dynamic of ways of thinking about the strategy, the ways of organizing for it for the first 5 or 6 years are all geared towards the idea that it's a local front in a global project. And the problems arise when that confidence starts to vanish. So I think that's what you'd have to do. is absolutely, climate is so emphatically a global thing, but it's about these specific power dynamics, in Washington, in Russia, in Germany, in all these places.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. We have 2 minutes or so left. I might just use the chair's prerogative to say one sentence on Michel Serres, and then we'll wrap up. I guess the provocative way of thinking about Serres and Rousseau will be to say that Serres almost entirely agrees with Rousseau, and the only thing that he disagrees with is that he stopped too early. So Rousseau limits the contract to the polis, to the community of human beings, and that's what Serres disagrees with. He said that's blind to the irreducible influence that the non-human has upon that human polis. It's like, it's the fights with cudgels. It's you're fighting it out among yourselves while you're sinking into the sand that you don't even notice because you're so infatuated with the human and the political. So that's his critique. But that's, in a sense, not saying that Rousseau is wrong. Everything that Rousseau says is fine. It's just that he doesn't include that broader picture. So the idea of the contract, of mutual obligations and so forth and everything, I think Serres is very happy with. And indeed, in using that contract metaphor, he's at least implicitly, and perhaps even more than that, he's endorsing. And so I think it would be a shame to see Serres only as rejecting Rousseau on the basis that he says, look, the polis is not sufficient. We need something much broader, and to miss the fact that the only reason that he's saying that is that he's bought into this way of looking at things, this paradigm to begin with. Anyway, enough for me. Let me lead us, if I could, in thanking Peter for an incredibly rich presentation, and an even richer, I think, and is it not often the case in these events, an even richer question and answer time. Peter has been incredibly generous with his time and also provided us all, I think, with a huge amount to go away and think about and ponder further to develop our own thinking. So please, would you join me in thanking Peter Hallward, our speaker.
Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for coming. Those are really good questions. And I'll think about all these different things. Great. Well, thank you again, Chris, for organizing it. And thanks for everyone for coming.
Okay. Thanks. Bye, everybody.